You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent, your host as always. This week, we are very delighted and privileged to have Sean Morrison, General Manager of Advisory in the APP Group's WA branch, who has been doing a bit of a roadshow recently on being a YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, in the studio today to have a conversation about just that, what it's going to take for our culture, both in the planning system, in the general public, for us to start solving this housing crisis, and how we can characterize that really by facilitating infill, facilitating large-scale development to help us solve this housing crisis that currently seems to have no end in sight, certainly not within this decade, in my humble opinion. Sean, thank you so much for coming in, mate. I look forward to a really robust conversation with you today.
Great to be here, Trent. Thank you.
For people to get a bit of an understanding of your background, we know you're a planner. We understand that you provide a lot of advisory services both to industry and government. Can you give us a little bit of background on where you come from, what you're up to on a daily basis?
Absolutely. So I'm a planner by background, as you mentioned. I've been in the industry for 15 years now. The initial parts of my career were very much focused on stat planning, so getting approvals for major developments, I guess big and small. And in the latter part of my career, it's been a bit more focused on policy development, research, advocacy, and more recently leading into like the business case preparation part of projects, which is kind of that early definition, costing, assessment of options and the like to kind of get things ready for decision makers to make investment decisions.
Okay, so the cool thing about your perspective is that unlike a lot of planners, and I say this with respect, you've actually taken a real interest on the economic feasibility side, and that seems to be a real gap in this industry that I've noticed, is that whilst planning is certainly a focus for planners and urban design, there is nearly a culture of that's not my problem, I shouldn't be having to worry about it. In fact, it's not my remit to worry about it when we start talking about whether this idea actually stacks up in the first place, both for private industry but also for government.
Absolutely, and I've been really fortunate over the last couple of years in particular, my current role, to work directly with people which can do development feasibility, modelling and the like, and working a lot more closely with QSs, looking at actual ins and outs and the innards of projects. And it really does become apparent quite quickly about how small choices, moving things around, design choices in some instances, the scale of certain things, how dramatically that can move the needle from something from being viable to not viable. And not so much with government projects, of course, but with private projects. If you don't meet the return that you might be wanting to seek, or that your mandate is, or whatever it may be, it just won't get built. It's as simple as that.
It's a pretend policy. I remember Megan Adair, who's a very well-respected professional in this industry, speaking a couple of years ago at, I think it was a UDIA event at the Crown, and she was the first person I hear characterise it as death by a thousand cuts, where one policy that's driven by virtue most of the time, let's say it's an arts contribution or Department of Education contribution or any of the contributions, or even restrictions, setback restrictions, height restrictions that start to get put in place at either a local government or state level, in its isolation doesn't seem to be much of a risk or a threat to the efficacy of being able to provide housing in Western Australia. 1% policy isn't making a big deal. And given that it's not, we don't really need to do any economic study to model whether it would or it wouldn't. Most of us would assume that 1% isn't moving the dial too much. However, when you accumulate a number of these policies together that are either direct financial taxes or duties on a development that get passed on to the end user, or I guess a restriction on scale in one certain way or another, or a restriction on architectural flair, for example, all of these, as they start to add up, really have accumulated to get to a point where, in the absence of doing proper economic feasibility studies on this at a planning level, have now rendered a large spectrum of our development industry nearly mute.
It's fascinating, right? We're in a housing crisis, and everybody's aware of that. And every time you listen to the radio or read the news online, you'll read something related to the housing crisis. Yet when you drive around and walk around the city, I don't see many cranes. Something's not quite adding up right. And we know that the private industry, at least in Australia, builds over 95%, I think it's even over 97% of all homes. So they have a very important role to play. And it needs to be actually considered beyond the realms of just property, right? Because property development is a function of investment And the property sector is not the only sector where investment can be channeled. So if your returns are particularly low or below what you might be wanting to seek as an organisation, you just buy bonds or you put your money somewhere else, which is part of the reason, and I appreciate the reason is a lot more complex, is that whilst we do have a housing crisis, I don't see a lot of investment into development at the moment, unfortunately.
It is, you're right, in a normal, natural, free market where there are minimal restrictions, where there is an undersupply, the market would generally be incentivized to provide supply. And I think we're seeing that now, especially in the land development space. I find that the ideology of a developer is to solve the market's problems within your remit, being housing supply, and you are rewarded for that to the extent that you provide that supply and to the extent that the supply is needed. That's essentially how you would quantify the reward. But you do that if you want to stay in business within the path of least resistance or within the least risky way. And currently, and has always been, unfortunately, for our environment, for our collective tax dollar, it is continually land development on the urban fringes. That is the only pathway right now, and a limiting pathway, I should say that, looking into the pipeline in the future that Jane Bennett spoke to, where we can solve somewhat the annual problem of housing supply, or at least try to meet it, and we're not, within the realms of risk for reward that is logical. Now, unfortunately, that is where it stops. Infill at a small scale is nearly non-existent when you think about how it was 10 years ago even, and how it needs to be now. And infill at a large scale is even more critically impinged by not only the financial side of things, but being further impinged by the outcomes of planning that are making the financial side even tougher to stack up in the first place. And I think that's what we're here to talk about today, is how our cultural expectations have over time pushed our planning framework to really impinge on the financials of providing what is a basic need to society.
If you look at the infill stats, it's quite obvious that Perth hasn't been hitting its targets for quite some time. We dropped as low as around 30% for the last two recorded years in 2021 and 2022, and the next year should be available in a couple of months, I think, for 2023. Probably one of the most interesting things actually within that very low figure is that actually quite a lot, I think it's around 2/3 actually, of that infill development is actually just single houses, triplex, duplexes and things like that. It's actually not apartment development. So that certainly indicates to me that something's not going quite right in terms of capacity of the planning framework to facilitate the development that's actually been set out for ourselves that apparently we want to build.
If we can dive deeper into those numbers for a second, you spoke there to about 30%. There was a white paper that was written over a decade ago, I believe, called Directions 2031. If I'm not incorrect, the target there is that we're looking to meet about 47% of our new supply by 2031 being urban infill. A few years ago, we were getting a lot closer to that 47% than we are now, and it seems to be getting worse. Is that the point you're making?
That's what the stats show. Mind you, the most recent year recorded, that 31%, is 2022, and it does seem apparent that probably that drop from 44% in 2020 is probably the result of some of the COVID stimulus, which is, of course, very heavily weighted towards single house dwelling. We've probably kind of reached the peak of that within the last kind of 6 to 12 months, so that's probably worked its way through the system by now. I would expect that those numbers probably to tick up a bit. That certainly still doesn't remove the issue that the vast majority of those infill dwellings are still effectively single houses, which means that we're not getting the new apartment buildings in those precincts which we've allocated for growth.
And it also is at odds with what is an additional push within the hierarchy, I guess, to couple goals of tree canopy, which I think we're all a fan of, with the targets within the planning system. It doesn't make sense to me that we continue to do anything other than maximize and facilitate high-scale urban infill when that is the pathway to protecting the most tree canopy we can. If we continually facilitate the house behind a house, the small-scale development, then that is, for me, the pathway that has the most tree canopy degradation over time, right?
Well, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. You got to think of it as a fundamental level. So we're a sort of a big city at the moment. We're kind of just ticked over 2.3 million people, which is fairly large in kind of global context. And we're still growing very fast, over 3% actually in the last 12 months to September or June last year, which is extremely high rate of growth, which means, of course, that the city needs to change and adapt to accommodate that growth. The growth is coming. So when individual decisions are made in terms of where should that growth be channeled, if you were to, for example, save a particular tree on a particular lot on an intercity site, you may very well save that tree, but the growth still needs to be channeled somewhere else. It may very well go into a different kind of intercity location, Or, given the balance of growth that we're observing in the stats, it is also perfectly reasonable to assume that it would happen on the urban fringe, which consequently comes, of course, with clearing of what is usually virgin bushland. So it's not a zero-sum game.
It seems the big issue here, which is, I guess, the theme of today's conversation, is not that people don't want to protect trees. In fact, they use that often as a reason for pushing back on infill. It's misguided in that way, but that a lot of local governments, even up to council level, still have a defiance in the first place that density is a requirement for that local area. And to be frank, not in my backyard. We understand that there's more population, there's going to have to be more houses, but if it can be in the city of Swan on the outskirts, or the Shire of Serpentine Jarrahdale, or the city of Wanneroo, that'd be probably better for us and more appropriate. They really shouldn't be changing the local amenity of our local town in certain LGAs in WA, and I'm sure we know which ones we're talking about here. That seems to be the cop-out for me, that we're using the excuse of protecting local tree canopy in this LGA at the expense of broad-based clearing of virgin bush in certain LGAs, out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, and the YIMBY movement, which we profiled, in partnership with the Property Council, talks about turning a lot of these issues on their head where some of these arguments, and trees one kind of very discrete argument which can be used in that respect. And of course, it's perfectly appropriate to have plenty of trees in an urban environment, which is completely compatible with high density development, as we can observe in many cities as well.
More compatible, I would say.
I agree. But that can also extend to things like character areas. So what is a character area? So a lot of cities, and it happens in Perth probably slightly to a lesser scale, but it certainly does happen in pockets of the inner city, but certainly very much in the eastern coast cities, and particularly US cities as well, where very large tracts, or if not entire suburbs themselves, or very large precincts, somehow decided that that area has reached the pinnacle of form that must be preserved effectively in perpetuity, or new development that comes about must have some sort of synchronization or reference or protect or not be too observable beyond what might already be there. If you kind of look at some of the areas that are protected, it just might be a bunch of Federation worker cottages. Of course, there's plenty of sins in the past where we've gone way too far in demolishing extremely valuable places of heritage significance. But I guess I do have a fundamental issue with locking away large parts of the city, or highly constraining development in those parts of the city, because somehow we've reached a collective decision, when in fact we actually haven't. Some people have made it on behalf of others, that particular area has reached its peak form. And effectively that decision is completely at odds with a high growth city, with those stats that we were just talking about before.
That talks to me of the theme in the planning industry in Western Australia, and I guess it's across the country, but we're talking about WA here, where the planning system is, I think, more characterised these days as a means for control rather than a means for facilitation. If we think about the public service of planning, it should facilitate the provision of the basic need for everyone, and the basic right for everyone in this city, for shelter. And it seems that that is not the priority in Western Australia these days. It is more about controlling how that basic need is provided, as long as it suits certain policies. And ironically, as long as it suits certain ideologies, as I've seen many local governments bend into the grey to either support or refuse applications based on whether it meets their intent at the time. That is something that I think is really starting to rear its head now, in that the culture, not the policies per se, the policies can always be improved upon and revised, and they are always being updated, but the culture seems to really have moved to one of control rather than facilitation. Have you noticed that?
Planning and the planning framework and the controls within that framework, they're a product of choices and decisions, and can certainly flux with the course of time. People can change that over the course of time. But I take your point that the same framework can be applied in different ways and utilised in different ways depending on what your values are or what strategic intent is. And I'd certainly say there's examples in Perth where some LGAs, and the city of Perth kind of is a shining beacon in that respect, which has an incredibly pro-growth, pro-urban development understanding of what it means to be a large city, and would generally on balance welcome any application with open arms, with a view to in terms of how we can make it work. That experience, of course, is not universal, and some organisations would perhaps approach development with a more sceptical sense. And I guess that comes down to effectively an aversion to growth and to change. And that's incredibly, you can't codify that or outlaw that. That's effectively people's subjective values, judgments.
Yeah, I think they are being prolificated at a local government level, and to an extent the state level as well, in some ways we've seen in recent policies over the last couple of years. And what we are in now, as Scott Cameron has said a couple of weeks ago, is market failure. We're at a point now where the market is not even able to meet the demands, even though it would nominally be rewarded. Now, given we're in a point of failure, the system is failing. It is failing our population for a basic need. Imagine if this was food. Imagine the outcry if this was food or water, Sean. Housing, shelter being just as important. I think it'd be interesting to do a little bit of an exercise to strip the policies straight back and start to think about the ways that if we had no prejudice around what the current policies are, what policies could we enact to help solve this problem as quickly as possible? If we take away all bias about, we couldn't do that, they'd never approve that, we'd never allow that. If we just had a wartime effort to go, bang, we need to solve this problem within the next 5 years and it's going to be done, we're going to make sure it happens. What are a couple of things off the top of your head that would be done simply to go, yeah, it's fixed now?
I'll take on your broader point first. I mentioned this in my speech at the Property Council lunch when that YIMBY research was launched, and it was saying the purpose of a system is what it does, which is the function of a system is what it does. And I wouldn't just apply that to the planning system, but let's just say the whole development industry. Unfortunately, the function of the broader sector and associated systems and regulations has been to effectively not enable sufficient housing supply, and at the same time the supply that is delivered is extremely expensive. I don't think that anybody wants that, because even though the overall price is higher, developers are probably still making the same or even lesser margin. It's not like they just take all the uplift from where the prices used to be, right? So no one, whether it's a developer, planners, people in government, no one's said, hey, let's make housing more expensive. And it goes back to, I think, what you were referencing to what Jane or Megan said, where it potentially is death by 1,000 cuts. So in that respect, it is prudent to assess the overall impact of your system, accepting the actual outcomes as you can see them on the ground. That's a perfectly valid exercise.
Let's do the exercise. How bad would it be, for example, if every property zoned with a limit of 10 stories was allowed to have a limit of 20? For example, would that be a society-breaking policy, for example? If the positive was that it could turn a whole bunch of blocks in West Perth or East Perth or Subiaco or Rivervale from being marginal or not economic to, yes, we could actually start this tomorrow, would that not be a positive thing?
Potentially. My opinion would be, and having had the opportunity to observe other planning systems in practice and even being part of projects where I've had to do fairly deep dive reviews of other planning systems across Australia and the world. On balance, I'd suggest that the WA planning system, in terms of timeframes and getting to a point of a decision, I'd actually suggest is highly efficient, probably the most efficient in Australia. The issue, I think, with the system and more so the framework at the moment is that whilst decisions can be reached quickly or it's quite clear what's possible, the underlying development capacity that's made available within the framework is on balance too low in the areas where development is most viable or where developers wanted to deliver it.
And most required.
Absolutely. Where the market would consume it, of course. And also the areas which happen to have the highest levels of amenity and things like that. So anyone who's a planning geek like me can jump on Plan WA, the online mapping system which the WA government uses, and you can toggle on the local planning scheme controls or ARCO controls, and you can just pan across the entire metropolitan area. And you can effectively see, for those areas that actually do utilise the R codes, you can see what those R codes are allocated to. If you look all over South Perth, all over Victoria Park, all across the city of Vincent, all across most of the western suburbs, what you'll generally see, with some limited exceptions of very narrow pockets along main roads or very small proportions of precincts, and by the way, it's not a good thing to live on a major road, you'll just see a sea of very low density, R10, R12.5, R20, R40, whatever it may be, which I would put forward is a completely inappropriate in an inner city context. Anything within 10, maybe in 15 k's of the city should not be approaching any of those ultra low densities. And even if those allocated densities are a touch above what might be provided on the ground, anyone with some development experience would know that you don't bowl over a highly valuable house to build 1.2 houses or something like that.
So it's encasing the system in the first place.
So there might be some development capacity to go from 1 story to 2 stories or whatever, but without a sufficient jump, you actually don't have the drivers and the market fundamentals to enable change, which is partly the reason, and I appreciate there's many other reasons, particularly highly inflated costs, where you don't see a sea of cranes in a city that has a housing crisis. It's quite bizarre to me.
Because I think what you're saying here is the planning system, whilst it is efficient in its controls, in telling us whether we can't do something, it is not leaning towards facilitation. Certainly, it's very happy to tell us that no, your application for 10 stories is not appropriate given it is an R80 zoning maxing out at 4 stories, even though you believe economically there would be a market to serve all 10 stories here. You certainly as a developer wouldn't be going to market on a project that was too big to be justified by the demand in the market. That whilst it's very efficient in controlling that, facilitating solutions to the problem we're currently in certainly don't seem to be forthcoming. There doesn't seem to be an LGA right now providing solutions like, for example, the City of South Perth and the City of Melville did with the Canning Bridge precinct plan that saw a radical change to heights there that we're finally starting to see outcomes from that are really the only benefits we're seeing in that area. Imagine if we saw the same outcomes in 4 or 5 other precincts right now where local governments are able to either work together with other local governments or simply just be brave and start to really provide step changes that would incentivize the guys who do have the skills, the money on the ground in the first place to start making material changes, not incremental changes that are really just falling behind with population growth every year. We're not going to solve this problem by building triplexes and townhouses, are we, Sean?
No, we're not. And I hope we don't end up in that situation, but that's kind of where we're at. And look, it is great to see mini skylines popping up in areas like Applecross and South Perth, but I'm sure many of the developers in those precincts could attest, if they haven't already on your show, in terms of the extremely hard slog that they would have gone through to get to the point of delivering some of those projects. I guess that comes down to a fundamental cultural and values-based approach to development. If someone comes in with a project effectively represents economic development, saying, hey, I want to deliver this tower in South Perth, I would encourage decision makers and officers, even if that particular project might be beyond whatever the planning framework may have set, to assess it with open eyes. Some and plenty of officers and local governments will take that approach. Many others won't. And I guess that comes down to what is the function of a planning system. Is it as a highly legalised, strict method of control? And thankfully, and you might doubt me, but on balance, Western Australia does have kind of more discretionary leeway than other jurisdictions in Australia.
Yeah, through its design principles outcome.
Exactly. But effectively, and this is sometimes the issue I have with the way that we perceive planning frameworks, is that if you take the approach that everything is kind of fixed according to whatever has been potentially set out in that planning framework, and that anything beyond that is inherently about outcome, well, then you have to assume that you've effectively forecasted the future and can envisage what is the likely outcome on every single site across whatever area is being controlled, which of course makes no sense. Every development is subject to a willing landowner, a willing developer, a willing financier, if they're not the same as the developer, and then whatever the market conditions are at that point in time. And changes daily, if not hourly, and certainly across the years. So non-compliance in of itself is a non-starter for me if that's a reason for, well, there's no discussion here to be had.
I think we really created a segue there to the second crazy idea coming out in my head right now, is that when we're seeking discretion, as you said, Western Australia's system actually does provide for discretion more so than many other systems. The only pathway to discretion really is to prove design excellence. Now, this starts to become a paradox in my mind, in that the only way to start amortizing and bringing down the cost of each apartment, let's call it apartments for now, by providing more height, more scale, and amortizing the cost of the land, for example, to make a project stack up, is to then increase the cost of your development through design excellence, more architectural articulation, more expense on materiality. And I wonder, doesn't that really just shoot itself in the foot? If we're trying to provide lower cost apartments here through discretion on, let's say, height or plot ratio, built form, and then we're biting our nose off to spite our face by making each of those apartments more expensive through arts contributions and more expensive materiality in the first place. What have we really achieved there, Sean? Surely there is a pathway here where we can receive discretion, where we demonstrate, for example, not design excellence, because no one needs to live in excellently designed buildings. They need to live in functional buildings. How about functional excellence, or energy efficient excellence, or simply just market need?
Well, it's almost like the set expectation now for anything that's of a certain scale that'll go through that particular process and reach a certain level, which justifies its existence of being at a particular scale.
Well, you're asking for a favour as a developer.
Yeah, and I did make the point at that property council lunch is that the housing is the benefit, right? Particularly in a housing crisis, but that I would say that applies in all times. More housing is the benefit to the community. If every single house that we developed in the city went through the same processes, level of review But apartment
Single
buildings
dwellings.
do.
Yep.
The system would collapse immediately, and a housing crisis that's quite bad would get much worse very quickly. Every other product that we generally consume is industrialized, simplified, refined, standardized to a point which makes it most efficient to deliver. So, we think about vehicles. Of course, there's some level of customization, but the chassis and the main parts, the engine, whatever, they're kind of all the same, right? They come off a production line. We don't send each person's individual car to design review or planning assessment or whatever, and you might tinker on with some bells and whistles on top. That means, of course, that final price of that product is generally more affordable. And if you look at most consumer goods, in fact any kind of service or whatever like that has some level of standardization, they've all dropped in real terms over the last couple of decades. But housing, of course, has gone the complete other way around. And if you think about housing and the way that the current framework works, is that everything is hyper customized and adjusted through processes like design review, but not just design review, of course, where effectively there's no ability to make the delivery more efficient. So if we approach every project that everything can be moved around, every balustrade, every whatever can be tweaked and pulled, and a little bit of facade adjustment, whatever, it's just more and more cost, more and more customization, which is another part of the mix in terms of why we're at where we're at.
So would you suggest that a policy like that provided in the state of Victoria, where there is essentially like a standardized apartment book that developers can have a pre-approval on, essentially, if you get 6 quarter-acre blocks together in a block, you can build this, you don't even need a DA, you simply get a building permit.
Yeah,
is that the sort of outcome here, to start standardizing and you get your big builders to go, I'm going to do this 10 times around Perth?
Yeah, I've heard mixed reviews in terms of the success of that particular Victoria project, and it's certainly not unique to Victoria. Other jurisdictions across the world have done similar things.
Well, there's beauty in standardization.
Absolutely. And many of oddly enough, a lot of the places that we like to preserve, whether they're workers' cottages or some of those earlier apartment blocks, they're actually quite standard, and there's lots of them. And if you look at Sydney, they're in the process of preparing, I think what they're referring to as a pattern book, will similarly have kind of easy to approve baseline designs that will still get tinkered on a customised site basis. I think there's a lot to be said in relation to that. But going back to your actually initial point about broad upzoning, as we observed when we did look at this YIMBY movement across the world, a lot of cities are doing just that. Not crazy cities that we haven't heard about. I'm talking about cities like Auckland and Wellington and Sydney. Sydney, for example, has recently effectively upzoned an 800-metre radii circle around train stations and effectively said 6 stories, go for gold. It's effectively as of right.
Carte blanche.
Yeah.
If you're within a certain radius, go for it.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't dream of that in most places in Perth.
Potentially worthy of consideration, maybe
of course
not at that
it's worthy
scale,
of consideration, but is it being considered, Sean? No.
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly as part of Metronet, there's been a lot of work to build up at the precincts around there. What I would like to see is probably looking at the existing stations across most of the transit network.
Where there is already an activity centre, or could be.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of work that could potentially be done there. What we don't want to do is let things get so bad that you need to start going nuts with some of these things. So at Sydney, the median house price is $1.2 million or something, and you always hear these crazy stats that it take an average earner to 40 years or something to save a deposit, which is just crazy.
We don't have to be there, but we're staring down the barrel of that, Sean.
Yeah, so of course we want to be proactive, and if we know that there's structural issues and we know that things are kind of heading in one particular direction, it's perfectly valid to assess, well, okay, what are some of the big kind of moonshot changes we could potentially take so we don't end up like Sydney or other cities that kind of are at that upper echelons of house prices.
When we think about the gold plating of houses, as we're talking about here, a lot of why housing is more expensive, both as a single dwelling and an apartment, is simply there's more things in them. As a consumer, we prefer to have an alfresco or theatre, things that you wouldn't even define 20 years ago in a house. A couple of cars in the garage, maybe even 3 now, a pool, all these things we're asking for. But also the government through the NCC policies are asking for a lot more things as well when it comes to energy efficiency, which can be argued for. So the houses are getting more expensive inherently in the first place. But then we come to design review. Why do you think it is that it is only the apartment building that is put under the microscope from a design review perspective, when the project home on the fringes is essentially a carte blanche building permit as long as it meets setback requirements.
Some land developers might say it's a bit tougher than that, but I take your point. It's certainly relatively a lot harder on balance to do apartment developments.
From a design perspective, not even from a civil perspective.
Yeah, apartments are the exception, and therefore the threshold for determining that the outcome is okay is that we must think about it, analyse it, pull it apart, and we effectively need to flip that thinking. It's like, well, why is the threshold so high? Why do we need to justify its existence? Why is more height inherently a bad thing? And look, I can appreciate that people within that framework are working with existing systems, processes, etc., and things need to be documented and justified. And of course, there's the whole layer of legality on top of it as well. But going back to your earlier point in terms of, if we were to reassess how we kind of approach things in some of our system, it is about what are the layers of standards, expectations, processes, etc., that we've put onto apartment development that perhaps don't apply or apply in a lesser sense to single house development? And then is that actually enabling the outcomes that we want? Removing all other considerations, looking at the raw stats, it would imply no.
I think that's pretty obvious here that there is an implied bias within the system towards the path of least resistance being single dwellings, which is at odds with the state government's own policy of trying to incentivise urban infill. It's very hard to incentivise something when the system is still biased towards the other thing. It is working against yourself in the same sense, right?
Yeah, I would take the approach that it would be better just to remove some of the barriers for apartment development and broadening the range of sites and areas where the apartment development is possible, and the market will kind of do its things right. I think part of the issue is that the volume of good sites is too limited, which means that for all those things to come together for a development to actually get out of the ground, which we know is extremely complex, if you narrow the number of sites where that could happen, quite naturally, there'll be less overall delivery. I also think it's really important that as a byproduct of potentially trying to get to that outcome, we would never want to make land development more difficult than it needs to be. And I appreciate that many planners, including myself actually, probably would have had a different view. Look, other cities have done this, and not to bag on Sydney or anything like that. Sydney partly is as a result of its surrounding national parks and other various controls and constraints on land development. Yeah. Land delivery has been made quite hard. And I'd actually argue that Perth's very healthy land supply, and Melbourne is in a slightly similar position, has effectively functioned as a means to restrain our housing price growth, which on balance is a good thing. It would be a terrible mistake, in my view, to try to make land development and houses, because that's a perfectly valid choice for plenty of people, and Perth does it relatively efficiently, to want to make that more expensive just to kind of prop up another apartment outcome. Not that you're saying that should be the case, but some people take that view. It's like, well, how do we constrain this arm of development to somehow then force funnel
that's the control side, right? And as you mentioned, I would never argue for making that more expensive just to make apartments look slightly better. It would be the other way, actually. It's simply recognising the fact that it is a path of least resistance in the house and land space. It is far easier, biased far more towards that space for delivery by the government and industry, that in recognising that, we need to then try and make the infill side just as simple, far less risky, or far more facilitated, rather than the solution being control land. Let's leave land how it is, let it do its thing, but let's facilitate infill, given that we recognise how much harder it is to do than land. That's the argument I'm making here, is that it doesn't matter whether it's house or apartment right now, it's all dwellings. At the moment, all dwellings are a good outcome. Every new piece of supply you can provide is partly going on the way to solving this solution, which moves towards my third suggestion here. If we tear down policies and controls again and start thinking about how we make things cheaper, well, of course, we know that a material percentage of the delivery of houses and apartments, the cost there is simply taxes and charges. It's not just 1% for arts contribution. It's not just Department of Education contributions. It's not just public open space contributions. It's also developer contributions that pay for all the things that a long time ago the state government simply paid for in delivering as part of the general tax system. But what we have done, and what we continue to do 1% at a time over the decades, is push the cost of delivering new housing onto the end user of that housing. And the rest of us who already live in our brownfield suburbs go about our merry ways. And you get to a point now where you're paying over $1,000 a square metre on the urban fringes when it's actually not that much more expensive 20 kilometres closer to the city. Why? Because the cost the developer has to pass on of delivering these brand new infrastructure all gets pushed, whether you agree with it or not, this is the reality, all gets pushed onto the developer, every cent, which then gets passed on with a margin to the end buyer. Why is it that we can't be looking at this holistically again and going, you know what? We don't have to push every one of these expenses onto the end user, the young family. As a state, as a community, if we are going to facilitate population growth, we can all bear that cost a little bit between the couple of million of us, through the taxpayer, through the state government. That for me has been an insidious progression over decades now, where it begins making it harder and harder, and the baseline cost of new dwellings is lifting higher and higher.
In some circumstances, in some areas, particularly for apartment developments where community infrastructure is being brought into those developments themselves, or kind of contributions are expected, yet those facilities are available to the broader community, I take issue with hyper-concentrating those costs onto those ultimate buyers, as you suggest. I think that's inherently flawed, and we all pay a lot of taxes and charges and whatnot for the relevant authorities to provide community infrastructure available to everyone at a kind of relatively proportional basis. So I think a lot of caution needs to be taken in relation to that.
Exactly. So when we think about the situation we're in right now, a crisis, it makes very easy sense to me that there is no justification for something like an arts contribution. When we're thinking about priorities here, it's facilitating $1 million towards some architectural pieces in a park really priority here, rather than each buyer in that apartment saving a few $1,000s on the cost of land?
That public art contribution obviously doesn't apply to every single jurisdiction, but it applies to certainly a fair few. It'd be interesting to kind of trace back the history of that. My understanding is it started for major government infrastructure projects and somehow ended up being tacked on to apartment developments and other kind of commercial developments too. And, again, to use my previous example, imagine if every single house had to have some kind of plonk art at the front. Putting aside the impacts of the costs, I really don't like just the general principle of plonk art. It's that you have a building, a precinct or whatever, and you need to have this kind of standalone art piece plonked on or tacked onto something. Good design is good design, and you don't inherently need plonk something on top of that. So that's probably the broader issue I have with that.
I think policy. It's just generally that's the 1%ers, right? If we think about what Megan said again, death by 1,000 cuts, well, this is one of the cuts. One of the cuts we can easily repeal at a state level to say to all local governments, stop doing it. Stop charging all this superfluous extra taxes that don't actually achieve what we're trying to achieve right now, which is more supply. It gets in the way. If there are any policies that aren't helping more supply, we won't do them right now. We'll look at them in 10 years maybe, but right now, what is the priority? I think that's what we need to get to, Sean, is to tear down the structures, the cultures right now around control, this fear-based control structure, and really start to recognize what is the number one priority in this state, the number one crisis that will the next election and probably the next election after that will be centered on, and that is simply housing every single person we need in a home to their choosing.
As things get worse, and it certainly seems there's no kind of light at the end of the tunnel at the moment, unfortunately, and I think there's been some analysis recently that it looks like we probably won't meet housing targets that have been set on a national basis. It is not unreasonable to expect that there'll be some sort of community reaction to those outcomes. And we can see it happening on an individual localised basis, like in places like Sydney, where dramatic, large-scale intervention has needed to be necessary. But as you suggest, while we wait till we're in that position to act, let's act in advance.
Let's learn from the mistakes of others before we have to learn in the most critical way, right?
Absolutely. And I think, look, Perth's got a lot going for it. And of course, our resources sector is a huge part of that, which will always kind of naturally bring people in. But it's also worth remembering that whilst we are sort of a large city, not the first or second or even sometimes third city that people think about when they think about Australia. So we've got to think about our global competitiveness as well as a city. So why would someone want to set up shop here? Or conversely, why would someone leave? And I'd suggest that part of Perth's large growth trajectory has been the result of us being relatively more affordable than other cities in Australia and of course some other cities in the world. And it was interesting, I only realised this the other month when I read an article that Perth actually had the same population as Adelaide in the 70s and took them over, of course, in the 70s, and now we're like close to double their population. if we don't continue to deliver the housing, we don't want to end up to being like a low growth city. We don't want to unintentionally strangle ourselves. And the Financial Times has actually done some really brilliant analysis about this, is that this theme of incredibly high real increases in housing costs is a pattern that's repeated across the Anglosphere, i.e. English-speaking rich nations. And it's something to do with the fact about, going back to your point about control, is that we've tried to regulate, systemize everything and customize everything so much that despite the best of intentions of course, having nice buildings to live in, nice looking streets, people having some sort of level of certainty or input in terms of what happens in their communities, they're all on balance, perfectly reasonable expectations of an advanced society. But the clear byproduct of that and other things has been ultra expensive housing. And if you think of housing as an input into the broader economy, every dollar that's sucked into housing costs is a dollar not spent somewhere else. And as part of this YIMBY research is that housing is so fundamental to global competitiveness, people wanting to start families, people being able to enjoy life, people being able to spend things and time on things that bring them the most joy. And the converse happens when housing costs are extremely high. It just pollutes all these other aspects of humanity and society and the economy. So it's so much broader than just my rent's high. It unfortunately feeds into broader societal issues that perhaps we're observing as well.
That's right. When you think about the utility of housing, of shelter.
It's a basic need.
It's a basic need, right? And whether the house that you're living in cost $1 million or $300,000, it has the same utility.
Absolutely.
It provides you a place to sleep and be safe, right? But if you're spending that much more, that's $700,000 of mortgage every month, compared to bizarro you 40 years ago where the proportions weren't so high, on simply having that utility that is the same, then clearly it is impinging on the lifestyle you have in the rest of your day-to-day, right?
Absolutely.
You're not better off because your house is worth $1 million.
Yeah.
There is a wealth effect that comes from feeling better about that. But in terms of your day-to-day cost of living, you are actually worse off than you were before.
Part of the impact has been ameliorated by the drop in real prices of most other things that we consume. But it feels like the cost of housing is reaching such a point, particularly in the East Coast cities and some Northern American cities, where it has gotten so extreme, where that kind of drop in real prices of all the other things that we consume, whether it's international travel or laptops or whatever, it's gone to such a level where it is starting to impact people's lifestyles, as you suggest.
Last question, if we can put a lens on this going forward to the end of this decade. If we don't make some real changes here in our culture, both in society as an extrapolation of that, our planning system, what are we looking at in terms of where things get by the end of this decade for ourselves as Western Australians? Do we simply just have to look at Sydney and, well, that's what it will be?
There was a quote actually in that YIMBY report from a commentator in the UK saying Britain needs to act as a high growth economy and have all the attitudes related to that, which goes back to kind of our initial points, is that, well, if you are a high growth economy, a high growth city, then you should be observing large scales of change in the built form environment around you. And the converse of that, the YIMBY approach, to use a blunt term, is that we don't want large scales of change, or change must be incredibly moderated and controlled. The two don't go together. You're either high growth, high change, or you're not. And there's plenty of cities across the world where you see the consequences of them not embracing growth. You look at cities like San Francisco. Most of the city of San Francisco, are the kind of core area, it's effectively become a museum. I was shocked when I went there 10 years ago or something. It just felt like nothing had changed for decades. A city that has been the epicenter of the technological revolution feels and looks like it's barely changed in a couple of decades. You've got extreme housing prices, and that combination of things has actually precipitated its decline. We know now that, for example, the tech sector is kind of moving to other parts of the US and things like that. People are leaving San Francisco because, well, why am I paying so much money for this tiny little apartment in San Francisco when I could have a mansion in Austin or something like that?
Because again, the utility.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So think of it as an input into the economy, and it's just so fundamentally important that we get it right, because it does have much longer term impacts in terms of our attractiveness and competitiveness as a society.
Sure, Morrison, I think we'll leave it there. It's been a very insightful conversation about where we're at, what radical things we could do to try and fix where we're at, and if we don't, what things look like in the future for us, which I think all of us in West Australia are very proud to not be right now, to have not been historically, but certainly should start getting worried about the fact that we will be if we don't really start to wake up to this as a society, as a development and planning industry as well, to be a part of the solution and not the problem. Thanks for coming in, mate.
Thanks, Trent. Much appreciated.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!